morning, everybody. My name is John Blythe. I'm a senior partner at Foster & Partners Architects in London, and I've titled this, this talk this morning, Searching for a Cure, and it's about, as Paul mentioned, the Ellison Institute of Technology. There's four key people behind this project who I'd like to just briefly discuss. The man on the left is a chap called Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison founded a company called Oracle in 1977, and it was one of the first database companies that produced sort of software. They now employ over 160,000 employees around the world, and they're one of the largest software companies. They also have a huge Oracle Cloud service, but that in turn has made Larry one of the world's richest men. And as part of his commitment with that wealth, he's pledged to give a percentage of that away for charitable causes, and this is where the Ellison Institute of Technology really was born. One of the things that he came into contact through a good friend of his, Steve Jobs, when he was being treated for cancer, to the man in the central left there, a man called Dr. David Agus, who's one of the leading cancer specialists in the world. He was treating Steve for his condition, and he's pioneered a number of different methods of treating cancer, one of which he helped Lance Armstrong. He had a very rare blood cancer and developed a way of using platinum in an infusion to help him get rid of that sort of condition. So a very prominent doctor in the US, particularly in the field of cancer, but he's also a writer. He's made several New York bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers, mainly to deal with preventative medicine and preventative health care. So Larry and David kind of go back around, I'd say, about 10 years, and Larry really committed some funding to David's Institute of Transformative Medicine and really made that become a reality. The chap in the central right is a man who recently held the position of Regius Chair of Medicine at Oxford University, Sir John Bell, and he's another person who Larry has onboarded into his institute for the Oxford building that we're currently designing. Sir John Bell, again, prominent medical and scientific person in his field, very strong connections with both industry and obviously at Oxford University. He worked and orchestrated the team back in 2020 who created the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine with Oxford University. So again, an amazing clinician and scientist in his field. And then the lady on the right, Lisa Flasher, she is our day-to-day client, a phenomenal sort of force of nature, and has delivered the Institute in LA and now relocated to Oxford to help us deliver the Oxford project. So this is the first building that Larry committed his resource to in Los Angeles, and it gives us a bit of an insight. The first thing we did when we were approached for the project is to go and have a look about what it was all about. It carries a lot of Larry's kind of personal taste in kind of materiality, particularly the use of timber and a softer sort of feel to it. But also interestingly, the planning of it. You can see three buildings here. The two buildings on the left, Foster & Partners laboratory buildings for Stanford University. You can see they're very sort of linear and organized and efficient in nature, and as you would expect for a university or a collegiate sort of environment. So the dark blue spaces are lab support, the mid-blue spaces are laboratories, and the lighter blue and green are sort of write-up spaces and PI offices. Now, you can see the plan for the Ellison Institute. It's a very long, thin site, but it's very mixed up in comparison to those two laboratory buildings, and that has been done absolutely on purpose. The circulation kind of zigzags through the building, and some of the lab support is across that corridor, and it's designed to make scientists sort of bump into each other along their sort of day-to-day work and create that sort of encounter that Dr. Agus when he was planning this building, feels generates more conversation, more collaboration, and more chance sort of discoveries in that plan. And that's something we've adopted in our plan for Oxford. The other thing, Larry has a considerable art collection, and the idea of the building telling a story through art is something that we very early on were asked to sort of consider. So a few of the examples that they have in the LA Institute, you see the Library of the Human Genome. That bookcase contains a sequence for the human male genome. And when you open each one of those volumes, you can see that sequence. So it just gives you a sort of visual feel about how long the human genome is. Apparently the female genome is another 50 books, so make of that what you will, but quite an interesting stopping point around and an inspirational point around the building. They have Picasso there. You can see his abdomen. He actually had intestine cancer in his latter life, and he painted a self-portrait which they acquired. And you can see the sort of red spots in his intestines. Jeff Koons' elephant, another interesting fact about elephants, they produce 40 times more of a particular protein than humans do, which means they don't get cancer. And so there's a lot of research trying to understand how that can be developed in humans, and genetically sort of genetic therapy can be used as a sort of preventative measure. Ai Weiwei's willow tree. Willow is a source of aspirin, a very old drug used for painkilling and blood thinning. And then the image on the right, again, another installation within the Institute, but you can see 7 rocks on sort of moss pads. They're designed to represent each of the 7 continents, and then you see that rock that's sat on its own, and that's designed to represent cancer. It's in fact a meteorite, and it's the sort of alien in the field. So the Ellison Institute predominantly started sort of around 2015, 2016, with mainly focus on sort of health and medicine, as Paul mentioned, and the sort of the smaller text you can see are all of the separate research streams that they're developing, but also through a number of collaborators. They're talking to Tony Blair Institute. They've got them involved. Food security is a massive thing in global conflict. Tony found out as his life as a politician, and his particular charity looks at making food security more, or food more secure around the planet to try and prevent some of that conflict. There's the use of artificial intelligence in government innovation, something Larry's quite keen on developing. He's certainly one of the forefront people in investing in AI and what that can bring to society, from whether it's managing infrastructure or crime. They're all interesting research fields. And then, of course, there's climate change, and there's again, this is a developing list, but you know, looking at the efficiency of batteries is one of the research fields that they've got going at the moment. So looking at our site, we were approached in 2022, and the client came to us with 2 sites that they'd simultaneously acquired. And we were kind of like, well, it's not in the middle of Oxford. And then later explained that obviously most of the land in central Oxford is tied up with the colleges. It's very hard to acquire decent sized pieces of land. But also, interestingly, there's a huge future expansion in southern Oxford. There's a science park currently there with 22 plots on, but there's also plans afoot for a science village with up to 2,300 new homes. So a significant investment in expanding Oxford into the science and research field, into what is a poorer part of Oxford. And you can see one of the commitments as well is to extend the railway line, that dotted line. Again, that will extend into just beyond our site as it goes. The other thing to mention is it's also near to the Cullum Centre for Fusion Energy. There's a number of very powerful computers down there which the Ellison Institute is going to tap into to do some of its computational research. Looking at the 2 plots, they're very different in character, and you can see the one on the left there, Littlemore House we call it. It was part of the old Oxfordshire Mental Health Hospital, and the NHS sold it in the 90s and carved it up. So the image on the left there are old buildings that were of a better quality. We're redeveloped as housing. The 3 buildings that we inherited on our plot were converted into an institute for computer gaming and music. So very much that site is more suburban, it's more hemmed in. Plot 18 on the science park is much more natural, and you can see the difference between the 2 sites here. So one surrounded on 3 sides by buildings. The buildings you can see on site are Peabody Trust affordable housing. So we have a number of setbacks that we have to adhere to on that particular plot. And then you can see this, the Littlemore Brook plot was, it was flattened when they created the science park, but it has a brook running down the left-hand side of the site, and that site actually floods, and we had to take that into account when we designed the building, but surrounded by nature as opposed to surrounded by buildings. And that led us to a very simple approach in creating the 2 buildings that make up the Institute. One was to effectively complete that inner courtyard with the Littlemore House buildings. So, and then the Littlemore Brook was really to obviously make it look out into that green landscape around it. One of the conundrums was connecting the 2 plots. They're not connected currently, and we came up with the idea of creating this walkway and crossing a piece of land which we'll go on to, which had a lot of constraints attached to it. On the Littlemore Brook site, it has a 6-metre drop across the site to the corner, and there's 100 car parking spaces which the client wanted to retain. So we pushed them into the corner and created a sort of flat deck. The other thing that we had to do was rooftop plant. Obviously, laboratory buildings can be quite cumbersome and heavy. And in creating that deck, we managed to put some of that plant underneath and liberate the roofs, which has allowed us to put a lot of PV collection. We're using ground source heat pumps as well. We've got a lot of boreholes around the site. But that's generating 550 megawatt hours of energy and provides roughly a third of the total site energy demand for us. Underneath those panels, we have a rainwater attenuation system, which helps us collect and attenuate any heavy rainfall. Again, with the brook, these particular brook site is susceptible for flooding, so a lot of the new regulations have demand that you capture a lot of your water on site. And around the solar panels and on top of this system, we're using a green roof system which helps us enhance ecology in terms of planting that with wildflowers and attracting insects and birds. So you can see, if we look at the plan, a number of very scattered sort of laboratory clusters, let's say, and they have each of some of the research projects that I showed you earlier on attached into them. You can see the purple area in the bottom right is the clinic, and underneath that clinic we have an MRI scanner, which again will plug into helping the NHS to do some of their screening, and we have CT scanners as well on the first floor. And you can see from that plan, as I mentioned, you can create these smaller clusters. It's almost like an incubator, really, that these different fields of research can either use a wet lab or a dry lab and have a series of write-up spaces and offices and lab support around them. Another thing that was quite interesting with the LA Institute was really creating that journey around the campus. And so there's a route that we formed around the quad, but also we wanted to connect a series of key spaces together. And we have these 5 key spaces that sort of make up a sort of area for more collaboration of different sizes of people within the campus. Again, just looking at the old and new, you can see the buildings on the left-hand side there, the old ones. They were built in 1902 and really comprise of 2 wings that are sort of L-shaped. And they were dormitories for male and female, connected with a recreation hall in the centre. And then if we look at the right-hand side, that's the new wing that we've attached to complete that quad. It's divided by an entrance pavilion in between, but they're more generous in terms of their height, 5 metres floor to floor, which makes them really good for wet labs and servicing wet labs in particular. Again, some of the buildings that we inherited, so that's that central building there, and it's got these amazing sort of Victorian trusses in which we're trying to retain and create a new space there. And the idea is that's potentially a library. The doors on the left open up into that garden in the central courtyard, but it's reconfigurable for a number of events, is this particular space. The recreation hall also through that basement undercroft connects us through to the auditorium, which is a 250-seat auditorium, and then further into the atrium, which is the centerpiece of the larger new wing. So here we see the auditorium, and as I said, when we were sort of going through a briefing session with Sir John Bell, he said, there's not a lot of 250-seat auditoriums actually in Oxford, particularly in South Oxford. So we slightly increased the size of what we were originally thinking to create this space, and you drop down from the basement level into this bowl. The idea is it's flexible, so larger auditoriums tend not to get used all of the time. So we've made it so that it can house 3 different modes. We have a collaboration. The bottom 6 tiers can be flattened into tables and more of a sort of classroom arrangement. And you'll notice that the fins around that upper concourse can be opened and closed. Similar to, we looked at the Barbican actually, which has got a fantastic theatre in where, you enter in through the side doors, and that inspired us to create this flexible space which could be open, and, in that central one, symposium mode, so people could come and go and sort of sit in the wings upon that concourse and have separate discussions. And then the third view there would be, you can close the whole thing down and have a focused lecture. As we pop up from that auditorium space, we come into the atrium, and another key thing about the Institute is having science on show. Patients who are receiving infusions will be toured around this building, and that's partly very deliberate from Dr. Agus's point of view, is that the scientists can see the patients, and the patients can see the scientists working on their ailments. And we have this 2-story tissue culture lab there. Tissue culture is very important for testing cancer treatments, so that's really the heart of that space. We have lower vibration labs down in the basement for microscopy, I can never say that word, as well. The other thing we looked at doing is, Lisa was very keen from some of the tours we saw around. We went to see the Crick and some of our buildings, and scientists tend to build themselves in. And they stockpiled. We went just after lockdown, and they were stockpiling lots and lots of materials, and that in turn led to sort of quite cluttered labs. But there was no eye contact, no eye level engagement within the lab. So we started talking about, could we make a lab bench a little bit more like a kitchen island, so people could have conversations in there when they were not, there needs to be focus work as well, but there's also discussion that needs to happen. So we took some of that ideas and developed a new design for a laboratory bench. And we've got that into a prototyping stage now, and we're testing that out in some of the Institute's temporary buildings. And what's really interesting is, weirdly, very simple device. The D shape to the end of it really does attract people to sort of have little huddle meetings along it, which is a surprisingly simple way to create some interaction. And also, you can see we've cleared a lot of the racking above, so that goes into the perimeter of the labs and in roller boys underneath the labs, so they can almost wheel in what they need rather than trying to surround themselves with it all of the time. And that's a view of what it will look like. So we have umbilicals that drop all of the services out of the ceiling and onto these benches, and then you can put fume hoods and whatever they need to do the tissue culture within that space. Similarly, we developed a range of furniture sit-stand desking for the main sort of open floor plates for the dry lab computational side of things, and write-up spaces for the scientists. And then just jumping outside the building, we have on that new wing that we created, the elevation's over 100 meters tall, and these are some sketches that Norman sort of sent us about how we could potentially break up that elevation. We have a lot of different setbacks from the surrounding buildings, and that height limit So that allowed us to start thinking about how this facade could respond to some of that. And this was kind of the outcome of those sketches, moderating daylight coming in, allowing views out, allowing in non-laboratory conditions, we have a top and a bottom opening window which allows ventilation through and into that space. And you can see the sort of chimneys as well breaking up that. So these bring a lot of air into the basement plant and also allow exhaust out from some of the laboratories. The exhaust has to be higher than the floor level, so we decided to create sort of features out of these. And again, one of the conversations we're having about sort of Venetian chimneys being slightly over-exaggerated, but they help make a sort of identity and break a facade down. And again, internally in the courtyard, the facade responds. This is either side of that central atrium. They have an upper balcony space, and then we have a TPO chestnut tree in one corner. And again, this is where you enter from that walkway that connects the other building. So responding to that sort of access point. We enlisted Fernando and Pedro Caruncha, two amazing Spanish landscape architects, to do sort of the landscaping concepts for the building. And originally we were thinking of that sort of central quad as almost just a cruciform with a square. Actually had a square auditorium, and through sort of dialogue with Fernando, he came up with the idea of using this rose petal as a geometry, and it really transformed how you sort of move around that garden. You can come out of a number of places on the facade, particularly these four kind of modules you can see here, but as you move around that garden, you move around that water feature which sits on top of the auditorium, we're hoping it really creates this kind of amazing sense of moving in between landscape. And that's something that's probably the third thing that Larry's super keen on is landscape, perhaps almost as keen as the architecture itself. He uses it himself as a counterpoint for doing his work, to sit in nature, and it helps him sort of focus and concentrate. So he's very, very keen on developing this, and we're actually now prototyping this, so we're bringing species in from around Europe. We have a nursery in Cambridge which we're assembling this, and you know, they were all just going to sit in basically a field in the nursery as they acclimatized, but we've managed to convince the client to allow us to set out the garden one-to-one with some gravel paths, and then it's really going to help the composition and some of the species selection. And the species selection partly comes from the history of the mental health hospital. So it had a productive garden, our site, with cherry trees, pear trees and apples, and we've used partly that for the palette, and then some more ornamental trees, particularly magnolias, and one single ginkgo tree, which we've put in the corner. It's a smaller courtyard off the main courtyard, and the clinic surrounds it. But the interesting about ginkgo trees is they're a symbol of resilience in Japanese culture, very old prehistoric trees. So, and they turn a beautiful yellow color in the autumn. So this single ginkgo has its corner there in the clinic. And these are some of the earlier work from Caruncha. So integrating seating into the side of those benches, and really, you know, having that depth as you move around the garden. You'll get this parallax of different hedges and geometries of hedges as you move around the space. So we think it'll be very dynamic in comparison to a kind of typical grassy quad. And again, that's the water feature in the center of the courtyard. That sits on top of the auditorium. That's going to bring daylight through into the auditorium. We can obviously black that out with LED panels, with LED chromatic panels. But the idea that you get this shaft of light over a sort of rippled caustic effect into that space is something we've been developing. Then connecting the two buildings together, we have the woodland walkway, and that weaves through. It looks a bit of an arbitrary curve, but it actually does so many things on the site. So you can see the purple squares are the footings for that walkway, and we have the slight problem that there is a burial ground which the former hospital, unfortunately, when people died, they would bury them in that sort of blue hatch. So we have to stay clear of that and jump over it. And then there are a number of protected trees that we have to move around. So that line really does sort of thread a needle, particularly at the top of the site there, where you can see the agreement that we have is with the people whose land we're crossing. The only point we can cross is at where it meets our plot 18 at the very top there. So it's been quite a geometry to finalise. And then another thing that Dr. Agus brought us in the design process was the idea of perhaps meeting somewhere midway along that walkway. And this is a kind of small analog space. And he told us a story about the Johns Hopkins Medicine Tower over in the States. And apparently students used to hide out up in this tower and discuss their work. And he thought it'd be a great idea to somehow recreate that in the design of what we call the nest, which sits in and amongst the trees off that walkway. And again, this is like a mini version of another space that we've designed on the campus. But you approach it along this walkway, and it's an analog space. Again, looking around some of the university buildings at Oxford, the Beecroft Physics Building was quite interesting because they had these small little breakout areas which just had blackboards in, where people could go and discuss ideas in sort of a relatively confined environment, let's say. So we brought that into the thinking. And that's reconfigurable as well. You can pull the seats off the side of the dome and configure that to whatever requirement you need. But it's only designed for sort of 10 or 15 sort of people. As you come from the skywalk, you come into the top level on the left-hand side there. You come in at level 2, elevated into the building. If you come from what will be the new station or from the rest of the science park, you will come up and underneath the building from the right-hand side. And as I mentioned, the brook creates a particular approach to the architecture. So a lot of buildings that are in close proximity to this brook have to lift themselves out of the floodplain and not disperse water onto other people's sites. So that led us to putting the building on stilts effectively so that water, when it does flood, can come underneath the building. And we use the water feature to bounce light under, but you have this veranda that also has an aspect onto the brook. And as you approach from the station, this would be the view. You come up under the belly of the building and into the reception, this central space here. The building's fairly simple compared to Littlemore House. It's a rectangle with a sort of central atrium. Again, we can cross-ventilate it and bring air up through the building. There's also a small terrace, again, a little satellite cafe for people working in this building as you come off that walkway at level 2. And that's another view of what that looks like. And as you enter, again, the architecture and the interiors echo what's happening within the Littlemore House plot. And similarly, as you come in on that central axis, you can see a robotics lab. The Ellison Institute have a number of partners who are developing quite interesting things, and they want to show that off in that partner lab on the left-hand side. So at the main entrances to the institute, there are a number of sort of showcase laboratories, and then in the distance behind there, you can see we've got another smaller auditorium. Again, this came from discussing about a lot of the Ellison scholars. They run a program for students. They're recruiting students from around the world who will jointly be working with Oxford University and the Institute. And we started talking about how interesting the old anatomical theatres were. So Dr. Agus picked out this Agnew Clinic painting, and then we started looking at some of the very early anatomical theatres, and that one on the right-hand side from Purdue. See these very steep-sided walls and very much a very close environment. So we wanted to try and distill that into a new version of that, and we created this spiral step ramp underneath the dome. The dome becomes the beacon of Littlemore Brook. And that can house at the bottom about 15 people, but it can expand. People can occupy the spiral. There's small seats around the edge of that spiral to look into that theatre there, and it can hold up to about 85 people at full capacity. And this is a model that we built. So the inner frame is timber, glulam timber, which we're having made by a company called Blumen Lehmann in Germany. They do amazing things with wood. And then the outer dome is actually a revolving shading structure that we can moderate the glare coming in and the heat gain to that space. And again, we did the usual analysis that we would do to try and understand how that works, how big the louvers need to be, what orientation. And then the blue shading you can see rotates around that inner dome. And we can actually send it all the way around. The northern piece of the dome is clear, so we can bring that around to create more shade if there's a glare problem within the space. And this is my final slide, and perhaps one of Larry's favourite spaces in the Institute. So we've created that much smaller sort of atmosphere within this space. So we're really looking forward to seeing this appear on site in the near future. And I think that was the last one. Yeah. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much for that. This is a very complete project, even though it hasn't started yet, because it's everything from soup to nuts, isn't it? It's landscape, it's buildings, it's retrofit. And then I suppose in terms of the purely new, the redesign of these lab benches and that whole proposition is a kind of, is an exercise all of its own. And I suppose this fits into a long line of Foster buildings which have examined everything from climate to working practice. Any particular challenges on this one, or precedents you could draw from previous Foster work?
Well, you can see there's, I don't know if this mic's working. My mic working? Better to use that one. No, is that working? Yeah, I can hear it. Yeah, so you can see actually we did, one of the things that we borrowed from was, for the dome, was Norman's autonomous house for that dome structure, which he never realised in built form. So there's definitely certain, obviously the Reichstag as well, using that adaptive shading. So there were some bits that we brought in from older projects. I think challenges-wise, dealing with old buildings, and we're trying to meet BREEAM Outstanding, and what you have to do to those buildings to make them suitable for the next 100 years is, I think, has been one of the biggest challenges. Really, it's meant having to lose some of the things we didn't want to lose to make the insulation and the envelope work better. So I think there's a tension between restoration and environmental and sustainability that it's been quite a tough ride actually for that.
And I suppose just from the point of view of combining aesthetics with sort of sustainable issues and fresh air, the facades and those fins have obviously picked up something from the Bloomberg Centre in the City of London. You see these magnificent stone things. Is that the same material here?
No, we're not using stone on this one. We're working with Langeroog, who came in at an early point in the process, and we're developing a type of concrete with a finish on it. So we wanted to try and do something a bit more monolithic than the stone that we got on Bloomberg. So it was trying something again, but in a slightly different way. But it's a similar palette, and that's a palette that Larry is very fond of. The sort of limestone and the bronze and the oak timber is something, he does time and again in a lot of his developments, and it's a very warm palette, non-clinical. He wanted it to feel residential and more like a sort of hotel kind of feel to it, rather than something that was institutional.
Now, the whole use of concrete these days is controversial, let's say. But I'm assuming that, with Foster's track record going right back to the 80s and 90s with projects in Duisburg, which were looking at energy control and low carbon outcomes, that your analysis says actually using concrete in the right way, you can make it work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a very, in terms of cladding buildings with things, you've got to pick something. And it's we did look and worked with Langeroog a lot about how we could mould thinner pieces of concrete. So the architectural concrete, you do have to use a slightly higher carbon content. Everything that's a grey concrete, we use in the usual things that we've used over time, the recycled blast furnace slag. So, we're anywhere we can use a lower carbon concrete, we do. The architectural finishes,
we've sort of made a way that we can put them through Langerock's factory in a way that keeps them as thin as possible. So we're trying to reduce that material where we can. The good thing about concrete is it lasts for a very long time. So it does have its benefits, and there are a lot of discussions about whether stone is actually lower carbon than concrete these days. So it's a sort of ongoing debate that we're always trying to grapple with, really.
And what's it like working for a client who's obviously one of his big interests, if not obsessions, is the whole business of sustainability and carbon? Does he go everything with a fine-tooth comb?
He's quite involved, yeah. So he's interested in every facet. So you have to tick every box, really. And Larry in particular is very into technology, but in the same breath, he's also very into nature. And we'll talk about how when he was younger, he spent his time climbing the hills in Yosemite National Park. So he's very connected with that and his gardens. I mean, he owns some of the most beautiful gardens in the world, and he holds them very dear to his process of doing what he does.
I was very interested in the way that when you brought the landscape architects in, it wasn't actually, oh, well, we've done this, just landscape
stick a bit
it
of
out.
turf down.
It was to actually make a sort of significant intellectual contribution to the project. Could you just say a bit more about how that developed and how that relationship worked?
Yeah, I think it was just bringing them on early enough in the process. We'd kind of worked out roughly what we wanted to do with the buildings, with the inward looking and the outward looking. And then the Carunchos, really, we left them to have a think about it. And then they came back. We went to see them in Madrid, and they pitched a few ideas at us. And we just thought the rose was something that, if we hadn't have done that, we would have probably, as Foster's like to do from time to time, sort of said, do it like that kind of thing. And we left them alone, and they came up with a completely different idea. And I think it was interesting letting them do that. And they came up with a different approach, which we all kind of collectively thought was genius. So it was great collaborating, but at the right level of kind of involvement, I think, was important.
I mean, I suppose anyone who's looked at the work of the practice over a long period would have noticed that actually, right at the very beginning, there was a great interest in architecture as objects in landscape. I mean, I think some of Norman's earliest projects were in forests and had to do with woodland trails and things like that. And then it sort of went through that period where everything was, the high tech, glistening and gleaming, but you always knew that somewhere there was some sweaty bodies generating all that metal in sort of furnace land. And in a way, the practice seems to almost come back to a certain sort of route, doing larger and more significant projects, but actually re-engaging with the natural world and a kind of world of ecology, but almost from a scientific perspective as well as an emotional perspective. In other words, the reasons for doing it are not simply appearance or because I like nature, but because there's a sort of fundamental scientific basis to making things work together.
Yeah, I think that, and I think in terms of the planning process, it drives a lot of that integration. So we've had to work. When we've planted we're going to be planting over 300 trees on that site. I think we removed 8 to make it sort of happen, the things that were already in that courtyard space. So, but the ecology side of things, again, is a real challenge to meet on a particularly confined site. We don't have a lot of green area around us for the size of the buildings that are on it. So, we had to use those roofs and think really hard about how we use the roofs on sort of multiple levels to increase some of the ecology that we wanted to tick to get the best ratings. So
I think this is the first wooden walkway you've ever designed, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. It's still got challenges. So, it weaves a very precarious path. So we're in the process of trying to find places to put footings now. So some of the bodies were not necessarily planted where they were supposed to be. So there's a very careful process going on to make sure we don't disturb anything. But yeah, that's already changed a few of those locations. So yeah.
And I gather as a result of this project, there's a sort of knock-on project which is going to take place in Nashville. Can you say just
That's
a word
right,
about
yeah.
that?
So off the back of this particular process, Larry has commissioned us to look at a new campus for Oracle in Nashville, which he's acquired a site which is over 70 acres on the banks of the Cumberland River there, and we're currently in the early stages of design on that one. But again, it's got a very significant kind of connection with nature and with the river, which yeah, is ongoing, but very interesting, and almost an expansion of what we're doing in Oxford.
Well, from the city of gleaming spires to the world of country and western, another journey in the Foster story. John Blythe, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.